Black Mages are one of the quintessential job classes. They have a design that is recognisable in an instant. It's very clear what their role is within a party, and if used in the correct manner, they are nothing short of a wrecking machine, able to tear through enemy defences with consummate ease. But even though all of that may be true, the role of the Black Mage has evolved quite a lot since its debut in the original Final Fantasy. As the years have passed, new traits have been added that have fleshed Black Mages out, making them much more unique, diverse, and practical. And we can't wait to delve into them all as we explore the complete evolution of Black Mages. When the Black Mage was first introduced in Final Fantasy I, it served as one of the three core mages alongside the White Mage and the Red Mage. Each of them had specific roles. The White Mage, for example, focused on defensive play thanks to their ability to heal, remove dangerous ailments, and provide defensive enhancements to the party. The Black Mage then served as the antithesis of this, focused on offensive play thanks to their powerful elemental spells, their ability to enfeeble the enemy's performance, and their potential to bring about instant death. The Red Mage then served as an intermediary, able to fulfill both of these roles at the same time, but to a lesser degree. But outside of their ability to wield black magic in isolation, including the most powerful black magic after they were upgraded to black wizards, there were numerous other aspects that were present, and these helped to define the role of the Black Mage in the Final Fantasy I party setup. The first of those was their attributes. Black Mages were geared around dealing maximum damage with spells, and on this basis, everything was focused around their intelligence. This was their strength, and spell damage was tied to this particular stat. But such a narrow focus came at a cost of everything else. It meant Black Mages had the lowest starting HP, strength, and vitality, and even though they didn't have the lowest starting agility or luck, they did have the worst stat growth in those areas when compared to every other job. This made Black Mages strong in the offensive sense, but weak when it wasn't their turn. And it meant that the use of Black Mages always came with a certain risk, as they could get pummeled much easier than any other job. Should they be silenced or run out of MP after nuking too much, they would need to rely on physical attacks, and in this regard they could only equip staves and knives. It meant their physical attacks were pitiful and would only graze most foes. Nonetheless, Black Mages were a solid addition to any party, and they were even adept at tackling the famed solo challenge, as shown by Sula here. They also had an iconic design that featured a pointy hat, blue robes, and an obscured face. And this all helped to create a very nice framework for game designers to use as a reference in future iterations. But as Final Fantasy II avoided the class approach, there were no playable Black Mages, and none of the characters exhibited any specific traits relating to the class thanks to the nature of the gameplay experience. Black Mages did appear as NPCs though, using the overworld sprite from the original game in different colour palettes depending on their location. It wasn't until Final Fantasy III that Black Mages returned as a playable class using the same sprite from the original game. Many of the traits were also similar. They were one of the original classes and had access to most black magic. Their intelligence stat was very high compared to other starter classes, and they were weak in almost every other department. Thanks to the addition of the back row mechanic, which nullified some of their defensive frailties, they were also able to equip bows of all things. But this time, instead of the Black Mage job class being replaced by the Black Wizard, in Final Fantasy III it was replaced by the Magus job class. Visually, this gave them a snazzy pair of striped trousers and a crescent moon ornament for their hats. Those who used the Magus job also gave up their ability to wield daggers and bows to focus only on magic. And in this regard, they gained access to the highest level of black magic, namely Flare, Death, and Meteor. It meant Final Fantasy III offered a small but natural evolution, but as the Super Nintendo arrived, the developers decided to build upon the established foundations, expanding what it meant to be a Black Mage. Unlike the three prior games, Final Fantasy IV saw job classes integrated into the story. It meant specific roles were assigned to different members of the cast, and in this regard, only 4 of the playable characters had the ability to use black magic, and there was only one who used it in isolation, Parom. Parom hailed from Mysidia, where Black Mages could again be seen as NPCs, and while he didn't wear the traditional pointy hat, he did wear striped trousers like the Magus in Final Fantasy III. But in addition to Parom, despite being classified as a summoner in the official sense, Rydia also exhibited the core traits that we would expect to see from a Black Mage. By the end of the game, they would both have access to every single piece of black magic, and this was done by leveling up as opposed to purchasing them from vendors. Parom learnt them faster, however, as he left the party halfway through the story, and the developers wanted to compensate for this. Much as we had seen before, Parom and Rydia could use rods, daggers and bows, but Rydia was also able to use a whip. And from the perspective of stats, intelligence was where they both excelled in comparison to the rest of the cast. But where Final Fantasy IV differed from what had come before was its use of unique abilities. In Final Fantasy III, every job was given a unique ability to complement its basic melee attacks. Thieves, for example, had Steal, and Dragoons had Jump. But as mages could also perform melee attacks, their unique ability was always just casting of magic. It wasn't until Final Fantasy IV that this changed thanks to Palom's specialization. Whereas Rydia's unique ability allowed her to use black magic in addition to her summoning magic, Parom was given two brand new abilities called Bluff and Twin. Bluff could be used once per battle to increase Palom's intelligence, something that then increased the potency of his spells, and by using Twin, Parom could perform spells with his sister Parom. By combining their powers, this unlocked access to two exclusive spells called Pyroblast and Comet, and thanks to these abilities, Black Mages started to develop outside of their narrow foundation. But even though strides were made, as Final Fantasy V returned to a dynamic job system, Black Mages saw a slight regression. They appeared again as a starter class, but unlike Final Fantasy IV, Black Mages reverted back to having no unique command ability. Instead, they were given a unique trait. Their pool of MP would be increased by 30%. They also had their access to bows and whips taken away, and could only use knives and rods again. The main difference between Final Fantasy III and V, though, was that despite the Black Mage appearing as a starter job, this time there was no need to upgrade to a different class of mage to learn all of the black magic spells. Due to their high magic stat, Black Mages could still hold their own in the back half of the game, but they weren't the best, and due to the mechanics, it was better to master Black Mage early on and use its black magic ability with a different class like Summoner, which had a higher magic stat. From a visual perspective, Black Mages in 5 drew from each of the prior appearances, and this was a nice tribute, but it also served as an inadvertent foreshadow as Black Mages were sidelined. For Final Fantasy VI, VII, and VIII, magic became available to everyone, and with roles diminished and Black Mages having limited defining qualities at this point, none of the characters stood out as being representations of the job. You could point at Terra, Red 13 and Renoa as loose examples, as they were more naturally predisposed towards using offensive magic, but they didn't tick other boxes, and as a distinct entity, the job class vanished until Final Fantasy IX. This temporary absence was one factor which made their return in Final Fantasy IX all the more spectacular, and the Black Mage representative was of course the adorable Vivi Ornitier. Aesthetically, he had most of the familiar trademarks: pointy hat, striped trousers and blue robe. He looked just like the 2D sprites from previous games rendered in 3D, and it was amazing. As the party's offensive magic specialist, Vivi had the highest magic stat, and as expected, the lowest attack stats. To coincide with this, Vivi could only use staves, the first time a Black Mage could only use one type of weapon. What's interesting though, is that based on what we had seen before, Black Mages would often fizzle out, replaced by more powerful job classes as the quest continued, but Vivi stayed relevant all the way through the experience. He could learn every spell in the Black Magic School, and he gained additional power and utility in the latter stages of the game thanks to unique support abilities. This was where we saw a significant evolution from what was seen in Final Fantasy IV. In the initial sense, Vivi had an ability called Focus. Much like Palom's Bluff ability, this allowed Vivi to increase his magic stat within a battle, which increased the potency of his magic. But where it differed was that Focus could be stacked, increasing Vivi's magic to its maximum of 99, something which was then retconned into Final Fantasy IV Advance for Palom to do as well. Vivi also learnt passive abilities such as Reflect Null, which bypassed a target's reflect status, Reflect ×2, which boosted the power of spells that were reflected, and Magic Elemental Null, which made all magic spells casted by Vivi non-elemental. These changes gave Vivi much more application than any prior Black Mage, but he also had numerous traits beyond this. As Black Mages had been sidelined for the last 3 games, Vivi was the first dedicated Black Mage to have a limit break. When he entered into a trance status, this meant Vivi could cast 2 spells in one turn via his double black ability, and if Steiner was in the party, Vivi could also imbue his sword. Beyond the gameplay, Black Mages in Final Fantasy IX also had a true, poignant influence on the story in a way they had never done before. Vivi belonged to a race of synthetic beings created by Alexandria with Kuja's influence. His fellows were enemies at the start of the game, but once they broke free of their shackles, they became heartbreakingly sympathetic allies, becoming self-aware and lamenting their short lifespans. It meant that in Vivi, we got to see Black Mages truly developed beyond their ability to just cast black magic with a high degree of potency. And between his effectiveness in battle and his bittersweet story, it has helped Vivi become one of the most beloved characters in the franchise and the face of the Black Mage job class. And perhaps because of his influence, some of this was then carried through to Final Fantasy X, despite there being no characters with specific job designations. Instead, there were illusions, and in this sense, Lulu was the game's signature Black Mage. But as she was only an illusion, she also lacked all the aesthetic signatures of her class forebearers, and perhaps the most unique twist in this regard was her weapon, as she forwent the use of traditional weapons such as rods or staves, and instead used an animated stuffed doll. This then played in with her base stats, as Lulu had the highest magic stat and joint highest magic, but also had the joint lowest strength, which she shared with Yuna, the other specified mage. Because of the sphere grid system, Lulu was not the only person who could use black magic in the long term, something that had been a consistent trait with black mages. However, she began in the Black Mage area of the grid, and her unique features made her the best choice for the role early on. Staying within her area of the sphere grid, the first major ability Lulu could learn was Focus. This had appeared in both Final Fantasy IV and IX under different guises, and in Final Fantasy X it was modified again, as Focus raised the magic stat of the entire party and also increased the party's magic defense at the same time. Soon after, Lulu could also learn a brand new ability called Reflex. This helped to compensate for Lulu's poor defensive stats by increasing her evasion, as well as her party members. Much like Vivi, who had double black, Lulu could also learn double cast, but even though it provided the same function, it now appeared as a standard ability as opposed to being locked out as a limit break. And that was because it was replaced by a brand new limit break move called Fury. This took the concept of multicasting to a whole new level. Instead of performing 2 spells in a single turn, if the player was skilled enough, Lulu could now cast up to 16 spells in one turn, all without using any MP. But due to the challenging nature of the input, it ended up being one of the worst limit breaks in the game in terms of damage output. Nonetheless, it was a nice evolution, and it meant that even though Final Fantasy X featured an inclusive system that removed roles as the game progressed, numerous Black Mage traits were present, and they were even expanded upon. Within Final Fantasy X-2, Black Mages then became part of Spirit in the official sense, and what we saw outside of the visuals was a pretty focused and authentic representation of Black Mages, even if it regressed away from what was seen within Final Fantasy X. At maximum level, Black Mages had the highest magic stat, and alongside Songstress, they also had the lowest stats in strength and defense. But whereas previous games had stopped there, when it came to highlighting the frailty of Black Mages, X-2 took it further by not allowing Black Mages to perform any physical attacks unless they were associated with an ability like Mug. To compensate, Black Mages again had access to Focus, but this reverted back to the Final Fantasy IX implementation. They also gained a new ability called MP Absorb, which functioned in the same manner as Osmos, and they had a new passive ability that reduced the casting time of Black Magic. It was pretty no frills, and it bore no real relation to what was seen with Lulu, but it was an authentic representation of the Black Mage from its earlier days in the franchise, and it even added some new quirks of its own. The next major evolution of the Black Mage was seen in Final Fantasy XI, as it had to adapt to appearing in the realm of the MMORPG. Black Mage returned once again as a basic starter class, and in the initial sense, it was pretty standard to what we had seen before. No matter what race was chosen, intelligence was always prioritized, and strength and vitality were always diminished. And when it came to weapons, their strongest affinity was with staves, as even though the physical damage was poor, many granted a boost to elemental spell damage. Their range of weapons was expanded though, as in addition to using daggers, Black Mages could now use clubs and scythes. It offered a bit more freedom, but due to the affinity with those weapons being very low, it was never encouraged for a Black Mage to enter into a physical duel unless they had a lot of backup. What's interesting about Black Mages though, compared to say Blue Mages, Red Mages or Dragoons, each of which we have delved into before within this series, is that Black Mages did not build that much upon what was established as the franchise built out, and instead offered a fresher take. Almost every character-based Black Mage had introduced new abilities and traits like Focus and Double Cast, but none of them were really available for Black Mages to use within Final Fantasy XI. That's not to say there weren't ties though. For example, Mana Well and Mana Fonds negated the MP cost of spells while under the influence, and this was one of the traits of Fury. Cascade also granted a damage boost to the next elemental spell, which was a regression of the Bluff and Focus abilities. Elemental Celerity served as a precursor to the passive ability that was then seen in 10.2, which saw a reduced casting time applied to using elemental magic, and Black Mages were also the only job to gain access to the top tier Black Magic. This was achieved without needing to upgrade the class, and it gave Black Mages a lot of endgame utility, much like we had seen within Final Fantasy IX. This iteration also introduced some new passive abilities, such as Elemental Seal, which increased the accuracy of enfeebling magic, Mana Wall, which let Black Mages lose MP instead of HP when attacked, and Conserve MP, which sometimes reduced the cost of casting a spell. Perhaps the biggest though came with the aesthetics. Black Mages in Vanity L looked very traditional in their AF armor, and looked almost exactly like Vivi and their 2D ancestors, albeit without the obscured faces. The result was that Black Mages were a very capable casting class, especially when paired with the right support job. They had many of the fundamental elements in terms of attributes, and didn't borrow too heavily from the built-out aspects of the job, but that makes sense as much of this build-out happened later on in the franchise, and the core development staff were predominantly involved with the earlier Final Fantasy games before working on Final Fantasy XI. Black Mages were then absent from the base version of Final Fantasy XII, as was the traditional job system. Spells were sold in stores, and anyone could unlock the licenses to use them. Things changed though in the Zodiac versions, where Black Mages returned as a defined class. In addition to black magic, they could now use some green magic to debuff enemies, and this gave them a traditional repertoire of spells, mostly elemental with some status effects for good measure. Their most interesting feature though was augments. Much as we had seen before, these were used to increase the potency of Black Mage spells, reduce MP costs, and extend status effects that were inflicted. But for the first time, they also allowed Black Mages to gain MP after dealing magical damage, dealing physical damage, defeating an enemy, or even simply just taking damage. And it meant that what we saw within Final Fantasy XII was actually quite comprehensive, as outside of the ability to cast black magic, which often wasn't an exclusive job trait, there were numerous wider traits associated with Black Mages that actually helped them to do their job better, outside of just dealing straight damage. Interestingly enough, there was a Black Mage that also appeared in Revenant Wings, and this built upon what was seen within Final Fantasy XI. Vahn's friend Kites had high magic power, low defense, and low speed. He could equip various rods, and many granted a boost to his elemental spell damage. Kites also had a unique ability called Charge, which, much like Cascade, increased the potency of his next spell. Black Mages also appeared as an enemy in the game, and in this form they had access to an ability called Intelligence, which was similar to Focus within Final Fantasy X, as it increased the group's magic. But even though Final Fantasy XII as a whole did end up having a very strong representation of the Black Mage, the job was absent from Final Fantasy XIII and 13.2, though they lived on somewhat in the Ravager class. Traditional black magic spells were abilities within their repertoire, but as they could unlock melee abilities too, this made Ravagers much more like Mystic Knights than anything else. It wasn't until Lightning Returns that we would see the Black Mage represented within this particular trilogy in an official sense. This came via a garb that could be obtained on day 4, giving Lightning a futuristic black robe. It came with 2 abilities, Rapid Fire and Quick Freeze, each of which allowed Lightning to cast a series of elemental spells faster than usual and without leaving herself vulnerable. But outside of being a nice ode to what had come before, there was nothing of any real substance within this particular appearance. That arrived instead in Final Fantasy XIV, and in this game, unlike pretty much every other appearance of Black Mages, they were not a starter class. Instead, players needed to first reach level 30 and equip the Soul of the Black Mage. This granted them access to black magic and a whole host of abilities that drew from prior sources to help increase their potency. Enochian, for example, was very similar to Cascade, as it increased magic damage for upcoming spells, and Mana Ward granted a barrier that nullified damage equal to 30% of maximum HP, which was kind of similar to Mana Wall, as they both allow Black Mages to escape physical damage. Ley Lines also built upon elemental celerity by allowing Black Mages to reduce their spellcasting time, but it also enhanced the move by reducing recast time and auto-attack delay. And then there was a return of multicasting via triple cast. This allowed Black Mages to cast 3 spells back to back with no casting time, and it was a welcome addition. To top things off, the Black Mage's artifact gear also resembled the traditional look for the class, albeit with an Eorzean spin, and in general, that was how Black Mages are best summed up within Final Fantasy XIV, a traditional class with an Eorzean spin. But after that appearance within Square Enix's now premium property, Black Mages did not feature within Final Fantasy XV or the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Each removed the notion of jobs or defined schools of magic, but there have been plenty of appearances of Black Mages within the wider franchise. They became available, for example, within Final Fantasy Tactics after training the Chemist job. With the highest magic stats and a solid arsenal of spells, Black Mages in Final Fantasy Tactics were potent damage dealers. However, it was easy for allies to get caught in the crossfire, so spells had to be carefully aimed. Ivalice's Black Mages also had a unique tool, the Magic Counter support ability. This allowed them to counterattack with the same magic they were hit by, and it made them quite powerful when dealing with other wielders of magic. In Tactics Advance, Black Mages returned as a default class but were restricted to certain races. But aside from this distinction, they were very similar to what had been seen before, including their magic counter ability. But this time their spellbook was a bit smaller, and to make up for this, they learnt the ability called Geomancy, which reduced the target's vulnerability to a certain element. For example, if an enemy was meant to absorb fire, they would instead take no damage. Perhaps surprisingly, Black Mages also made an appearance in the Crystal Chronicles franchise, namely in My Life as a King. Clavats and Maor-Ukes could take this job once a Black Mage Academy was built. They could learn the basic schools of elemental magic, as well as a handful of enfeebling spells like poison, and they could also use daggers. In fact, they got a special backstab attack which was probably better suited to a roguish class. When Vivi returned for a guest role in World of Final Fantasy, he brought other Black Mages with him. And this tribute game used him in a manner similar to Final Fantasy IX, having Lan and Rain fight them in the Mako reactor before revealing them as sympathetic allies. The Mirage Zapt also looked like a classic Black Mage as well, and could later be transfigured into Ramuh. The Black Mage has also appeared in Record Keeper, Mobius and Brave Exvius, as well as the Bravely Default series, Final Fantasy Explorers and Dimensions, and each of these iterations was pretty faithful to earlier implementations of the job. Perhaps the most curious appearance of a Black Mage though comes from a different franchise altogether. When Square Enix developed Mario Hoops 3-on-3, also known as Mario Slam Basketball, they included a handful of secret characters from Final Fantasy to spice things up. The Black Mage was the prize for winning gold in the Rainbow Cup, and also appeared alongside the White Mage, Ninja, and Moogle. It means that despite Black Mages being one of the quintessential job classes throughout Final Fantasy, that are famed for their appearance and their ability to cast black magic, the wider traits of the job haven't had a great deal of evolution. There have been small pockets of growth and similarity, for example between Final Fantasy IV, 9 and 10, and between 11 and 14. But often, developers have chosen to focus on the Black Mage's ability to simply cast black magic better than anyone else with a sole focus on amplifying damage. And when more unique abilities and traits have been applied, they have often been isolated and never referenced again. Nonetheless, it's been very interesting to dive into this particular job, as it shows how much diversity there has been in terms of how jobs have built out over the years. Hopefully you guys have found this study as interesting as we did. If you did, then please do consider hitting that like button, subscribing to the channel if you have not done so already, and if you have the time, please let us know in the comments below which has been your favourite Black Mage in the franchise so far. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.